Hi everyone. What you're about to watch is an interview I did yesterday with Connor Ibbetson. He's a data journalist at the global public opinion and data company YouGov, who has done work on the subject of the British public's trust in the press. So I thought to take time to ask him about YouGov's findings in that area. I hope you enjoy the interview, and if you do, then please ensure you're subscribed to this channel. Connor, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to me today. Let's start with a nice simple one. Do we in Britain trust our press?
Thanks, Sam. Pleasure to be here. That's a really broad question, and I don't want to oversimplify the situation by giving you a simple yes or no. The way we look at trust at YouGov is we've split newspapers into three categories: upmarket newspapers, mid-market newspapers, and then the red tops and the tabloids. We've also looked at TV journalists separately. And when we ask people about this, we give them four options, plus the don't know, to kind of rank their level of trust in those various outlets. So I can't just give you a simple yes or no. And I'd hate to oversimplify by doing so.
Okay. But when you do ask people if they trust or don't trust different types of media outlet, there is a big caveat, isn't there? Because people trust different news outlets and journalists differently. So is it fair to say it's possible for somebody to tell YouGov that they don't trust the press, broadly speaking, much, but to at the same time trust one particular newspaper or one particular journalist an awful lot?
Well, it's because of the way the categories work. Yeah, that's possible. For example, someone could trust the upmarket newspapers and then distrust the red tops or the tabloids, for example.
So are tabloids trusted more or less than upmarket or mid-market newspapers or other types of newspaper?
Well, looking at the figures we have for the general population, the tabloids certainly are much less trusted than the upmarket newspapers. Upmarket newspapers, they have the highest level of trust of the three categories between Britons, and 38% of Brits say that they trust journalists at the upmarket newspapers, compared to 54% who say they don't trust them. For the mid-market papers, that's where we see the real big gap in trust start to kind of develop. Only 13% of Britons trust journalists at these papers to tell the truth, compared to 78% who distrust them. For the tabloids, only 7% of Britons trust them to tell the truth, compared to 86% who don't trust them to tell the truth.
When you talk about upmarket and mid-market newspapers, could you just give a few examples of the types of papers you're talking about so people are clear?
So I think we define the upmarket newspapers, so they're the broadsheets, so things like the Telegraph and the Times. The mid-market papers, that'll be things like the Daily Mail, and then the red tops will obviously be the red tops, so your likes of the Sun, for example.
What about the BBC, Connor? Is the BBC trusted by Brits?
I can't even give you a yes or no there, because the general population is completely split on whether they trust the BBC. 47% of Britons trust them, and 45% of Britons don't trust them. It's worth pointing out as well that these results are taken from the end of April.
Have you observed any significant differences in terms of ideology when it comes to who is more or less trusting of the BBC?
Yeah, of course. Like many other things, kind of trust seems to be somewhat of a partisan issue. Taking, for example, Leave and Remain. Remain voters are more likely to trust the BBC than Leave voters. 59% of Remain voters trust the BBC, compared to only 39% of Leave voters. But what is interesting to see is, going back to the newspapers, is that both Leave and Remain voters seem to be equally or more distrusting of the mid-market newspapers and the tabloids. So 89% and 75% of Leave and Remain voters respectively distrust the mid-market newspapers. And for the tabloids, that rises to 92 and 86% respectively.
Let's not shy away from controversy here, Connor. Late last month, YouGov conducted a survey for Sky News, which caught a lot of attention on social media because it showed that Brits, I think it was 72% of Brits don't trust newspapers on the issue of coronavirus, and that 64% of Brits don't trust TV journalists on the issue of coronavirus. Could you talk about your findings at greater length there?
Yeah, of course. Well, I know the exact point you're talking about. In that one, of course, the NHS far outstripped everyone in terms of trust, but that's to be expected. I think rather than this being a drop in the trust in journalists, this is mainly driven by a rise in support for leading political figures. Boris Johnson, for example, has seen his ratings just skyrocket during this time. That particular graph that went viral, I think it was more of a net comparison between those groups.
And it appeared to show that politicians on the issue of coronavirus, or at least leading politicians like Matt Hancock, Keir Starmer, Dominic Raab, Boris Johnson, were more trusted on the issue than newspapers or TV journalists.
Yeah, but I think what that could be down to is a potential rallying around the flag effect. There's an article on our website that explains this at much greater length than I can do it justice here.
So would it be fair to say that newspapers and TV journalists are not trusted less now because of their coronavirus news coverage?
So the stats I talked about earlier are taken from that same survey when speaking about general trust, and there hasn't been that much net change since the last time we ran these questions.
Okay, it feels like a million years ago now, but before coronavirus was on everybody's mind, there was this small thing called a general election, and I wanted to ask you what, if any, impact last year's general election had on Brits' trust in different types of media outlet.
So if you want to talk about general election, I've got stats from mid-October, and I can compare those two stats that we took early December, just before the election. There's a little bit of shift in the stats here. It's not huge. There is still a big divide in who trusts what type of outlet. For example, when it comes to the upmarket papers, 55% of Lib Dem voters trust these journalists, compared to 38% of Conservative voters and 47% of Labour voters.
What about age? What age groups are the most and least trusting of the press in Britain?
Well, taking the upmarket newspapers first, what our results show is that the older Britons tend to be more distrusting. For example, 62% of over 65s don't trust these upmarket newspapers. That's compared to 31% who do trust them. And when we look at the younger age groups, for example, Britain's age between 18 to 24, 41% do trust the upmarket newspapers, to tell the truth.
Last question, Connor. According to your YouGov tracker on trust, red top tabloid newspapers, mid-market newspapers, upmarket newspapers, ITV news journalists and BBC journalists are all, going by the latest data you've presented for each there, less trusted than they were in 2003. How do these falls in trust compare with how trust in other professional fields has developed over the same period?
So we've got tracker data going all the way back to March 2003, looking at various high-profile figures. For example, judges is one. Judges, the level of trust in judges has fluctuated over the years, but hasn't particularly changed more than 5% either way. In 2003, 68% of people said they trusted judges. And looking at the figures for July 2019, that's at 66%. One field that has seen a bit of a slip in trust is senior police officers. So our historic data, March 2003, 72% of people trusted senior police officers, and that's compared to 55% in July last year.
Okay, Connor, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.